Okay, well, welcome. My name is Henriette Kets de Vries, and I manage the Cunningham Center for Prints, Drawings, and Photographs, but I'm also the curator of this exhibition. And I'm glad it's kind of a small group, so we can make it more intimate and you can ask lots of questions. I'm sure you have some. I started working on this material about 3 years ago, so a long time, and it's interesting how throughout the 3 years, lots of things have changed in terms of the political environment we're in and all these things. And it seems like her work, which has always been quite universal, has become more and more relevant for our, for our own, in our own political environment at this point. So, which is interesting and sad at the same time. Kollwitz, who obviously lived through 2 major wars, and when I started to envision this show, I wanted to kind of create these walls of that had to represent the war in some measure, and these 2 obstacles became kind of symbolic walls that had to kind of cut through her life. Since I also wanted to show her work in kind of a chronological order, starting at the beginning over there, and then increasingly, going through her the middle part of her life, which also shows a clear change in her style of work, and then going into the later part, which ends in the death series, which kind of shows the evolution of her life, but also of her work. So. She was born, I don't know how far I want to go into the bibliography, because I only have half an hour and I could talk for hours about her because she's so incredibly interesting. But her life started in Königsberg in eastern Prussia, which is actually a very interesting city, and I learned a lot about this city while I was doing research, since now it's called Kaliningrad and is actually in Russian territory. At the time, Königsberg was a German city, quite beautiful German city, with a lot of quite an intellectual hub of people that lived there, and her family was also quite an intellectual, social democrat family, quite liberal, quite progressive in their way of thinking about things. Her brother was a Marxist scholar. Her grandfather was a very famous minister and preacher of the free German church there, and so she had a very interesting background, and also a very progressive father who motivated both his daughters, who both were quite talented, in becoming artists. And he also allowed them a lot of freedom to roam around the city, which was a very interesting city. It was a port city. And she and her sister would walk around on the port side, and she really fell in love with the things she saw there and the people she met there. There were, dock workers and just the working class people. And growing up in this kind of socialist family, she really embraced the physicality and everything about the working class. And this became quite a theme in her work and in her life as well. So her early work, which you can see progressively over there, starts off in a very kind of didactic, more kind of narrative form. And she was quite, early on, became quite the activist, and she really believed in the kind of social, in the kind of revolutionary, she believed in revolution, and together with her father and her brother, she really felt that would be somehow the solution to a lot of the problems around her. She created these cycles of work, which are interesting. So the first cycle was the Weaver cycle, And then the Peasant War was also a group of Peasant War cycle. And then we have the Krieg cycle, and then the Proletariat, which we only have one work, which is on the outer wall there. And then the Death cycle was kind of her final cycle of works, and that concludes kind of her life as well. So the Weaver cycle, which has this very narrative, and it's too bad we can't walk around because I could show you all the little details, but the Weaver cycle has this narrative which was something that she got inspired with, which was Hauptmann's play, The Weavers. And Hauptmann was a playwright who was quite popular at the time among the socialist youth. And she was actually working on this Émile Zola, she was inspired by this Émile Zola Germinal story, and she started working on it. She really couldn't get her hands around it very much. And then she saw the Hauptmann play, which completely inspired her. And there's actually a little anecdotal piece from her diary that explains how she saw it and what it did to her and how it really made her want to work on this particular series of that represented this play. And so the works that she did are not really a perfect narrative of the play, but they give kind of the highlights that really kind of embrace the emotion of the play more than anything. And the things that she highlights are obviously the poverty and the grief and the hardship of these weavers that she depicts, but also then the rebellion, the uprising of the weavers. And more you see how the role of women in revolution start to become part of her narrative. And you clearly see that in the Peasant War, which is the next series she did. And the Peasant War, the works get bigger. I mean, she worked for a very long time on the Weaver series. I mean, she really worked, and that's really kind of she was an incredible perfectionist and really hard on herself, and she worked and reworked these plays. And then the Peasant War series, she got bigger and bolder because the Weaver series really started her career off. I mean, people really recognized her for the first time as being an artist of note, and she almost got an award for it, but it was taken away from her because it was actually the emperor believed that a woman, in many regards, should not, be handed an award like that. I mean, being a woman artist in that time was still quite controversial, and especially a woman artist with the type of style and voice that she had was still quite controversial as well. So, she had to work against that. And but when she started the Peasant War series, she got bolder. She got her work started to get bigger. It also has incredible premonition of things to come, which is almost uncanny. She clearly was quite obsessed by the subject of death early on, and there's many stories that are told about why, the reasoning, the psychological background of Kollwitz, and why she started working on images of death so early on. And one of the things people say is that, well, she saw her mother go through the loss of a number of her children, and one of her brothers early on died, and that was actually something as a child that she experienced quite profoundly, and she writes about it retrospectively in her diary about the feelings she had about the death of her small brother, her baby brother, and also the guilt she felt. And as you can imagine, how a child sometimes feels the guilt for something that is completely unrelated to them, but still will take it on because her mother was not very good in expressing her emotions. These things, I'm sure, have had a lot of impact on her early on. But so it's a theme she starts working on, and it keeps coming back. There's all these echoes, and then finally in the final series, the Death series, that's when it really that theme comes to complete fruition, but with a certain level of resignation and more almost like she's almost consoled by death at the end. However, before we get to that series, after the Peasant War series, a lot of things happened. Obviously, World War I happened. And World War I had an incredible impact on Kollwitz's life, and not only on Kollwitz's life, on all women in Germany at the time. And that was another aspect I wanted to bring into the exhibition, was how the role of women changed throughout this incredibly turbulent period in German history. And how also all these influences from outside, like the propaganda materials, how they all shaped this Germany. So what happened was that obviously coming out of this activist and revolutionary mindset, Kollwitz felt that war might induce change. At least war could be potentially a solution for the things that were going on in Germany. But she felt already kind of, she knew also obviously that war means death, and she was very afraid that things would happen to her sons. She had two, sons. One of them was of age to go and join the army. The other one was too young, but he was very compelled to go, and he felt quite strongly about joining the army. And it was actually Kollwitz who helped convince her husband, who had to give the consent, to allow him to go and join the army early, which was a guilt that she carried later on, because her son died after the onset of the war. He died almost immediately. I mean, he died in Belgium, in Flanders. And when she found out, it was that moment that changed everything for her. He was her youngest son. He was also the more artistic son of the family. She was very close to him. And I think all these things layered made an enormous impact on her life, but also her art. And that's one thing I wanted to kind of show with this barrier as well. You get to the Creek series, which I'm standing in front of, where you can clearly see how much her art changes from a more kind of realist, kind of social realism, a more narrative. She goes into a style that we can classify these days as expressionistic. And there was a clear moment that she decided to do this, because after the death of her son, she was obsessed not with revolution, but with peace, and how she could somehow have an impact on what was to come, and how this period was going to progress, and how she could stop wars from happening and boys from dying. And so she starts trying all these different ways. And another thing that she also started working on exactly right after her son died was this memorial to him. I mean, that became an obsession. And she worked for many, many years on concepts and ideas for a memorial that could do justice to the death of her son. It ultimately ended up being this incredible memorial that you can visit in Belgium, which consists of two, and that's where her sculpture also came in. And then I brought in some sculpture here, which is also an incredible element in her work. But she made these, interestingly, she started out with all these different designs of these two parents holding each other, comforting each other, and you see a lot of these types of imagery also in her Creek series. However, what she finally came with was these sculptures of these two people standing separate from each other in their own grief. And there are life-size sculptures that are actually now at the foot of this cemetery in Belgium, which is a German cemetery in Belgium, and it's in a kind of a very strange, barren place. and it's an incredible, powerful experience to go there. And the idea of these two parents and their obviously likeness of herself and her husband, Carl, they're standing there side to side in their own grief, and right across from them is the stone where her son's name is engraved. And this separation of grief is an interesting solution that she finally came to, that grief is something you experience yourself, by yourself, and which was a very strong emotion that she came to in the creation of these two sculptures. So when we go back to the Creek series, so she was thinking about this sculpture, but she also wanted to make the sculpture, which was obviously extremely personal, but she also wanted to make a more public stance on her ideas of war and how things could be prevented. And she started making these more iconic woodcuts. And that came after she saw an exhibition by Ernst Barlach's work, who was a very famous Jewish artist who made these incredible sculptures and also woodcuts. I showed a little example of his work. We have some of his work in our collection as well. It's very powerful, very strong work, and these harsh lines just kind of, to her, called out emotion and felt to her like the language for the feelings that she was experiencing at that moment in her life. And it's interesting because there is a print over at the other side of the wall, which is called The Mothers, and that was, you see a group of mothers with their children huddling and holding their children very close. And that's actually a lithograph, and that was the only lithograph that she, out of all the sketches she made before she finally ended with this cycle, the Creek cycle, that she felt okay about. It was just the emotion was not there until she started working in woodcut. And so this series doesn't really have a true narrative. It just has these it's very obviously very emotional and very and raw. It starts out with this very interesting moment. It's called The Sacrifice, and clearly it's a mother holding up her child, a clear symbol of sacrifice of the children, a theme that ran through this whole cycle. And so she also, what was interesting that her work, and in the 1920s, which this cycle appeared, her activism became strong again, but this time for the peace movement. And her work started to become more and more appropriated for different causes, and she was asked to make work for particular socialist causes at that time as well. And that's, for instance, that this image, the hunger, it was used over and over for different moments in time. This was for the aid to Russia and for hunger. And then later it was used for the aid in Germany and symbolizing the hunger in Germany. And it's just like this ongoing repetition of this iconic image. And that shows something about the universality of her work, that it keeps being reappropriated for different causes. And so, and then I wanted to include some of the propaganda materials. And so these two walls, this one then symbolizes obviously World War I, and this one World War II, even though most of the posters on the World War I wall were post World War I. There's only one on the other side that is actually created during the war, which is interesting. I think a lot of the material that was made was later, because posters using propaganda material like that was also quite new, and it started actually at the onset of World War I, that people started to use posters to kind of rile up the crowd and rile up the people, and they were kind of a populist way of getting these messages across. And what I found also interesting is that a lot of the language and the visual language that you see on the posters clearly resonated on Kollwitz, and I don't know, who was influenced by what. But for instance, the Hungersnood poster over there has a lot of kind of similar qualities to the hunger poster here. So there's a lot of back and forth between in its visual language. And then I wanted to include, I know the big table in the other room, I wanted to include different kind of more ephemera, like newspaper, magazines and things that were going on during World War II. And that's also what this wall is about. This side of the wall is actually mostly election posters for the Nazi Party. The other side is later, and you see interesting shifts in the way that they are addressing women, which I found so interesting. The way that here women are still shown kind of in all the facets of life, as being addressed as the different ways that women were actually employed in this period. They were working in all different ways as a mother, but also they worked outside of the home. And this is also this is after the women got the vote. In 1919, women actually got the vote in Germany. So things changed quite a bit, and women became a very important group to address in the elections as well, which hadn't been before. So you see a lot more women posters with female images on them. And then the other side, you see the more overt Nazi propaganda posters, where there are clearly the Nazi idea of the family starts to come to fruition. This idea of the family as being kind of the center and the core of the empire, and especially the woman became a very important tool to create a new force of, they wanted to have more babies. So the family became kind of a very important place to put all their energy, and especially women. And women were addressed in different ways, like in the magazines. There was a Nazi Party magazine, the Vrouwenwarte, which is very interesting in ways that they addressed women through cooking and clothing, but then also how do you raise the perfect German soldier. And so there's a lot of emphasis placed on the role of women and how that, in which ways they could have more children. And they also started to come up with awards for women, like the Mutterkreuz, the Mother Cross, which was an award. If you had a certain number of children, you would be awarded either bronze, silver, or gold. And these were all methods to encourage women to stay at home and have children. And this started early on in that Germany did have quite a problem with its birth rate. So that was another stimulating factor. But in terms of Kollwitz, in terms of her life, she clearly, after doing this series and the success of this series, she was also became one of the first women to be employed at the academy. However, that all changed after Hitler came to rule, and in 1933 she lost her position, with a lot of other people as well, because of her communist affiliations and her socialist inclinations. And her art obviously was very, very well known. She was quite famous at the time in Germany, and I think that's one of the reasons why she still got treated with somewhat, more respectfully than other artists during that period, so put it that way. But her art did get finally removed out of museums, and she was kind of, at that point, she was also much older. She was resigned in the fact that that was happening, and she kind of was very, I don't know, at that point, she just realized that that was just part of what was going on, and she was resigned.
Was she turned into a degenerate artist?
Well, it's kind of interesting because there are different takes on that. She was included as a degenerate artist, but her work was never included in the degenerate art exhibition. There's been different, people have been saying different things about it. I'm not 100% sure if she actually was included or not, but she might have been on the list, but then her work was never put on there. So I don't know exactly how that turned out. Yeah. Oh, 5 minutes, okay. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say about Kollwitz, obviously. I'll just shortly will say a little bit about the death series, which you see on the last wall, where you can see kind of the resignation about death and the fact that she had to move out of her house in Berlin, where she lived with her husband, and she moved out of Berlin because obviously it was getting more and more dangerous. Her son Hans and her family tried to move as much of her art out of her apartment as they could, and they did save quite a bit, but a lot of it did get destroyed eventually. She moved out to Moritzburg, first Nordhausen, then she went to Moritzburg, and that's also where she died, and that was in 1945, right before the end of the war, which is a very sad thing in itself. However, there's now in the latest literature there's kind of speculation on if she actually committed suicide or not, because she had a very clear death wish at the end of her life, and in her diary she talks about wanting to end it all, but her son Hans actually says, well, you have a responsibility as an artist and as a public figure to stay strong, and she kind of takes that in and promises not to kill herself. But obviously, what happens at the end is, she kind of comes to terms with the world around her, but she still, one of her final pieces, which is on the wall over there, is Seed Corn Should Not Be Ground, which is a very strong peace protest work that she actually did very fast. And she really wanted to kind of make that her final testament, which was this idea of this mother trying to hold these young boys from escaping and, going out to war. And that's one of those themes, the fact that she couldn't stop them, that feeling of desperation that she couldn't hold them back. And then clearly putting herself in that position, because as you can see in a lot of the works, you see her face coming back. I mean, a lot of the women look like her, and she had this very kind of, she was never clearly a very vain woman. She showed herself in all its, in her age, and she always aged herself much more than she actually was, which is interesting. But she puts herself in a lot of the roles, and because, as I said, obviously these works were extremely personal and could not be separated from the message and from the things that were going on around her. So one of the iconic works that I used was The Mothers, and since I'm standing here, I might have well pointed out, which she also had created a sculpture in the same kind of form, and it has a kind of beautiful three-dimensional quality. And it really just kind of shows this image of these women as being the ones holding back the children. However, what I find always so interesting, that there is this kind of dual quality in her art where she feels the guilt also comes through. She feels that she was partly guilty, and that I think that was part of the resonance as well in Germany, that the women also felt complicit in the death of their young sons. And as she also says in her diary, World War II, when they went into World War II, the attitude of women had changed quite a bit, while a lot of them had been riled up about World War I because Germany couldn't possibly lose, because they had never really lost a war in such a catastrophic fashion. But World War II, they really weren't, that same zeal was not there, and women were literally protesting and standing on the tracks of the trains that were going off to war, that have their young sons going off to war, but they couldn't be stopped. I think with one of the sculptures, I actually have a little excerpt of a mother, which Kollwitz describes, a mother who was so avid about wanting to get her son to not join the army, so she sent him to Switzerland, and she thought he was safe, but then on his own accord he came back and he joined the army and he died like a month later. So it's that feeling of hopelessness that she shows in her art in such a profound way, and which I felt it could only be told really by using her own voice. I mean, if you feel inspired, you should definitely read her diary. There is an English translation, and then there's a German version, which unfortunately is still the better version because it's much more extensive. But just to read her words and to read, also between the lines, because you really get the layering of Kollwitz, the person, because she's so brutally honest about how she feels. I mean, she doesn't try to gloss anything over. It's all about her own flaws, her own the way she looks at herself. And for instance, the first image, when you come in with her photograph, I have a little excerpt where she talks about the new generation and the new woman, and she really didn't feel like she was part of that generation or the new woman, and she felt like she was kind of dowdy, and she was constantly criticizing her own herself, and but at the same time creating this incredible artwork, which she did get appreciation for during her lifetime, thank God. So I don't know if you have any questions.
Well,
Yes.
I have a question. So in the process of kind of working through this and reading through her diaries, did that change how you thought about putting together the exhibit?
Oh yeah, and I, still, if I would put the exhibit together today, I probably would change a bunch of things, because increasingly you just start to learn and understand her better. And obviously you can never know the full Kollwitz because there's so many layers, and Taiga and I have had lots of conversations about that. It's when you read anybody's diary, there's what do you write in your diary versus what do you experience. There are always the highlights or the more difficult parts of your life that you put in your diary. And also the other thing you have to think about is what do you actually the fact that she already was famous or quite well known when she started writing her diary, which she probably had some sense that her work was going to be read, that her diary was going to be public at some point, even though she said she didn't want it to become public. The fact that she was well known already, she must have had some sense. So what you put in a diary when you have that kind of in your head, that's already a different thing than somebody just writing a diary for themselves. So all these layers. And also there's a whole other side to Kollwitz that we don't know yet very much about, because the diaries were compiled by family members, and what you want to put in your own relatives, the things that you want to be known about your family are also obviously private. And now with her granddaughter doing the second version, there's already a lot more there, and all the things that Hans took out are now in there, but there's still a lot of layers that we don't know about. She had a lover at some point. That part is just being kind of glossed over. There's actually quite the the museum in Cologne has a number of her of these works were called the secreta, which are the secret works that she did while she was having this lover, and they're quite salacious and, you know, kind of slightly pornographic. So there's a whole other side to Kollwitz as well. So it is very interesting to see all these layers and to try to understand the person and understand the time, because the time in the period she lived in is incredibly complex as well. So that was another aspect that really I felt was important to bring in to get a better comprehension of her as a person and an artist. So, any more questions?
Was she a member of the Plauwrijke or did you know her?
Sorry?
Was she a member of either of the Plauwrijke?
No, she was not. She was a member of the secessionists, and because they're the only group at that point that was allowing women. So there was later on, obviously things started to change, but yeah, there were only, and she was very critical of other artists as well, and honest about her own work, but also critical of other art. And she wasn't really very keen on expressionist art per se in the beginning. I mean, if you see the progression of her own work, you can see why she started out with a very kind of different sense of what she thought was really great art. But she constantly, criticized her own lack of, understanding as well. So it's interesting how honest she was with the things that were changing around her, and talking about the new generation of artists, and how the different levels of understanding, and how we have to give room to the new generation and all that. But so, yeah. Any more questions? No? Okay.